May 25th, 1979. A 6-year-old boy walked out his front door in New York City and was never seen again. His name was Etan Patz, and his disappearance didn't just devastate one family. It changed the way an entire nation thought about its children forever. This is the story of a little boy who vanished without a trace, a case that haunted investigators for over 3 decades, and a mystery so dark, so deeply unsettling, that when the truth finally came out, it was almost too painful to believe. Stay with me, because this story, it goes places you never expect. To understand what happened to Etan Patz, you have to understand the world he was born into. New York City in the 1970s was not the gleaming, tourist-friendly city you might picture today. It was raw, it was dangerous. Crime rates had exploded. Murders, muggings, drug deals, they happened in broad daylight. The city was practically bankrupt. Entire neighborhoods looked like war zones. Parents in Manhattan let their kids play outside, ride the subway, walk to school, because that was just normal. That was life. Nobody thought twice about it. Etan Patz was born on October 9th, 1972. He lived with his family in Soho, a neighborhood in Lower Manhattan that was, at the time, far from the fashionable place it would later become. His father, Stanley Patz, was a freelance photographer. His mother, Julie Patz, stayed home with the children. They lived in a modest loft on Prince Street, a walk-up apartment in a building that felt more like an artist's space than a family home. But it was home, and by all accounts, it was a warm one. Etan was described by everyone who knew him as bright, curious, full of life. He had blonde hair and blue eyes. He was small for his age. He loved superheroes. He loved his family. He was, in every sense, just a kid, an ordinary, beautiful kid living an ordinary city life. For months before that terrible morning in May, Etan had been asking his parents for something very simple, something that to a 6-year-old must have felt like a massive milestone. He wanted to walk to the school bus stop alone. The stop was only 2 blocks away, on the corner of West Broadway and Prince Street, just 2 blocks. Etan's older sister made that walk every day. He'd watched her do it. He wanted to be like her. He wanted that independence. His parents said no, and no, and no again. But kids are persistent, and Etan was no different. Finally, on May 25th, 1979, Julie Patz said yes. It was a Friday, the last day of the school week. Julie helped Etan get dressed. She put him in his favorite outfit, a light blue corduroy jacket, blue pants, and sneakers. She gave him $1 for a soda. She walked him to the door of their building, watched him step out onto the sidewalk, and that was the last time she ever saw her son. When Etan didn't come home from school that afternoon, Julie called the school. They told her he had never arrived. She called neighbors, she called friends, she walked the streets herself, calling his name. By evening, it was clear. Etan was gone. Stanley and Julie called the police, and here is where the first great tragedy of this case begins. Not the disappearance itself, but what happened next. In 1979, the systems that exist today to respond to missing children did not exist. There was no Amber Alert. There was no national database of missing kids. There was no coordinated federal response. When a child went missing, local police handled it, and in New York City at the time, that often meant a slow, fragmented investigation with limited resources. The NYPD did respond. They searched the neighborhood, they questioned people, they did what they could, but the trail went cold almost immediately. Etan's parents refused to accept that.
Stanley Patz did something that at the time was considered almost radical. He printed flyers, thousands of them, with Etan's photograph and description. He plastered them all over Soho, all over Manhattan. He put his son's face everywhere he could. And then something remarkable happened. The story began to spread. Local media picked it up, then national media. Etan's face, that blonde-haired, blue-eyed little boy in his blue corduroy jacket, appeared on the front pages of newspapers across the country. And then came the milk cartons. In 1984, 5 years after Etan disappeared, the National Child Safety Council began printing missing children's photographs on milk cartons. Etan Patz was one of the first. Suddenly, his face wasn't just on a flyer in Soho. It was on breakfast tables in Iowa, in Texas, in California. Every morning, families across America sat down to eat and looked into the eyes of a missing child. It created a national conversation, a national reckoning about just how vulnerable children were and how unprepared the country was to protect them. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan declared May 25th, the day Etan disappeared, National Missing Children's Day. That date, that single morning when a little boy walked out his front door and never came back, became a permanent mark on the American calendar. The case had become more than a tragedy. It had become a movement. But through all of this, the flyers, the milk cartons, the national attention, the presidential proclamation, Etan Patz was still missing, and his parents still didn't know what had happened to their son. The investigation continued for years. Dozens of leads, hundreds of interviews, dead end after dead end.
In 1985, a man named Jose Ramos was arrested in Pennsylvania on unrelated charges involving child sexual abuse. He was a drifter, a convicted predator, and, investigators discovered, he had a connection to the Patz family. Ramos had been dating a woman named Sandy Harmon, who had occasionally walked Etan home from school. Through interviews, investigators learned that on the day Etan disappeared, Ramos had allegedly lured a child fitting Etan's description into his apartment and had sexually abused him. Ramos later made a partial admission to investigators, telling them he might have had the boy with him, but claiming the child had left unharmed. Nobody believed him. But here was the devastating reality. Despite the suspicion, despite the partial admission, despite everything the investigators knew, there was not enough physical evidence to charge Jose Ramos with Etan's murder. No body had ever been found, no physical evidence directly linking Ramos to Etan's death. Ramos served time for his other crimes. He was released. He was sent back to prison on separate charges, and for years he remained the prime suspect in Etan's disappearance, never charged, never tried, never convicted. In 2001, a New York civil court took an unusual step. In a wrongful death lawsuit filed by the Patz family, a judge ruled that Jose Ramos was responsible for Etan's death. It was a civil finding, not a criminal conviction, but it was something. It was a formal declaration that this man, this predator, had taken their son. Ramos, from prison, appealed and continued to deny it. Then, in 2012, 33 years after Etan vanished, everything changed. And it changed in a way that almost nobody expected. In February 2012, police received a tip about a man named Pedro Hernandez. Hernandez was living in New Jersey at the time, working an ordinary job, living what appeared to be an ordinary life. But someone who knew him, someone from his past, had come forward with a disturbing piece of information.
Decades earlier, when Hernandez was a teenager working at a bodega on the corner of West Broadway and Prince Street, just steps from where Etan had lived, he had apparently told members of a church prayer group that he had done a bad thing, that he had killed a child. Police brought Hernandez in for questioning, and what followed was one of the most haunting, disturbing confessions in the history of New York law enforcement. Hernandez, now in his 50s, calmly described what he said happened on the morning of May 25, 1979. He said he had lured Etan into the bodega's basement with the promise of a soda. He said he had choked the boy with his bare hands. He said he had put Etan's body in a plastic bag and placed it in the trash near the building. He described it quietly, almost without emotion, as if he had been carrying this secret for so long that saying it out loud was almost a relief. The confession sent shockwaves through New York, through the country. After 33 years, there was a suspect, a confession, a name attached to the worst nightmare the Patz family had ever lived through. But almost immediately, the case became complicated again, and it changed in a way that almost nobody expected. Hernandez's defense attorneys argued that their client had a low IQ and was susceptible to making false confessions. They argued that his mental health history made his statements unreliable. They pointed out that there was still no physical evidence, no body, no DNA, nothing that physically placed Hernandez at the scene. Prosecutors countered that the confession was detailed, consistent, and corroborated by the accounts of people Hernandez had spoken to over the years, people who had heard him describe the killing long before he was ever a suspect. The first trial began in 2015. It ended in a mistrial. A single juror refused to convict, holding out despite the rest of the panel voting guilty. The country watched in disbelief. After all this time, after a confession, after decades of waiting, was justice going to slip away again? A second trial began in 2017. This time, the jury deliberated for 3 days. On February 14, 2017, Pedro Hernandez was found guilty of murder in the second degree. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. In the courtroom that day, Stanley and Julie Patz sat together. They had waited 38 years for this moment, 38 years of not knowing, of hoping, of grieving, of fighting, and now, finally, there was a verdict. Julie Patz, speaking after the verdict, said that she hoped the conviction would bring some measure of peace, but she also said something that cut to the heart of everything. She said that nothing would bring Etan back, that the verdict was justice, yes, but it was not healing. It was not the end of grief. It was simply the truth, a truth that had taken almost 38 years to reach them. But the story doesn't end there, because there is one more chapter, one that involves not just the Patz family, but every family in America.
The disappearance of Etan Patz fundamentally transformed child safety in the United States. And it's worth taking a moment to really understand just how profound that transformation was. Before Etan, the idea of a national missing children's crisis simply did not exist in the public consciousness. Parents worried about strangers, of course, but in a vague, background kind of way. The systems designed to protect children were minimal and disconnected. After Etan, everything changed. In 1982, Congress passed the Missing Children Act, which created a national database of missing children and required law enforcement agencies to enter missing child reports into federal systems. For the first time, a child who disappeared in New York could be connected to a sighting in California. In 1984, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was established, an organization that has since helped recover more than 300,000 missing children. It exists in large part because of what happened to Etan Patz.
The Amber Alert system, which was created in 1996 and went national in 2003, is the direct descendant of the awareness that Etan's case created. Every time you see an Amber Alert flash across your phone screen, every time you hear that jarring alert tone, you are experiencing the legacy of a 6-year-old boy who never made it to his bus stop. There is a number that is worth pausing on. Before the milk carton campaign and the national attention that cases like Etan's generated, the recovery rate for missing children in the United States was devastatingly low. Today, thanks to the systems and organizations built in the wake of cases like his, the recovery rate for missing children is above 97%. Think about that. 97%. Thousands of children who might have been lost forever are home with their families because of what this one case forced this country to confront. Etan Patz's body was never found. To this day, his remains have never been recovered. His parents still live in the same Soho apartment where they raised him, the same building he walked out of on that May morning in 1979. They have kept his room. Stanley Patz, who spent years photographing his son's face on flyers and fighting to keep the case alive, has spoken rarely in recent years. Julie Patz, who said yes to Etan's request that morning, a decision she has carried with her every day since, has occasionally spoken to the media, always with a quiet, unbreakable dignity that is almost difficult to witness. They are parents who never got to bury their child, who never got to say goodbye in any of the ways that grief is supposed to allow. They got a verdict, they got a conviction, they got justice, but they never got Etan back. There is something about this case that gets under your skin in a way that other cases don't, and I've thought about why that is. Part of it is the simplicity of the tragedy. A boy who just wanted to walk to the bus stop alone. A mother who finally said yes. 2 blocks. 2 blocks between home and the stop. 2 blocks that swallowed a child whole and left a family in pieces. Part of it is the face. Etan's face on those milk cartons. Millions of Americans looked at that face every morning for years. He became, in a way, America's child. A symbol of innocence lost, of danger hiding in plain sight, of the gap between the world we want to live in and the world that actually exists. And part of it, maybe the biggest part, is the question that the case forces you to ask yourself. The question that every parent, every adult, every person who has ever loved a child eventually confronts when they hear this story. What if it had been different? What if he had turned a different corner? What if the bodega had been closed? What if Julie Patz had said no just one more time? These are the questions that don't have answers. These are the questions that grief is made of.
Pedro Hernandez sits in a New York prison today. He is eligible for parole in 2042, when he will be in his 80s. Whether he will ever walk free is uncertain. What is certain is that he took something irreplaceable. Not just from the Patz family, from all of us, from a city, from a generation, from a nation that in the summer of 1979 looked up from its own chaos and realized with cold clarity that its children were not as safe as it had believed. Jose Ramos, the original prime suspect, died in prison in 2020 while serving time for unrelated offenses. He never faced criminal charges for Etan's disappearance. He went to his grave without ever fully accounting for what he may or may not have done. Some investigators who worked the case for years still believe the full truth of what happened that morning has never been completely told. Etan Patz would be 52 years old today. 52. Old enough to have children of his own. Old enough to have lived a whole life, a career, a marriage, birthdays, summers, ordinary Fridays. all of it stolen, all of it erased on a sidewalk in Soho before he was even old enough to read a chapter book on his own. There is a photograph that Stanley Patz took of his son, one of the last photographs taken before Etan disappeared. In it, Etan is standing in the family's loft, looking directly at the camera, wearing his favorite blue jacket. He is smiling. It is the image that ended up on the flyers, on the milk cartons, on the front pages. It is the image that an entire country came to know. Look at that smile. Look at those eyes. That is not a symbol. That is not a case number. That is not a cautionary tale. That is a child. A real child who was loved and who deserved to grow up. The disappearance of Etan Patz is many things. It is a crime story. It is a legal saga. It is the origin of systems that protect millions of children today. It is a case study in how justice can take decades to arrive and how it can arrive incomplete, unsatisfying, too late. But at its core, it is the story of a Friday morning and a mother standing in a doorway and a small boy in a blue jacket walking away down a New York City sidewalk into the unknown. We remember Etan Patz not just because of what his case changed, but because of what he represents. He represents every child who didn't make it home, every parent who stood at a window waiting, every morning that turned into an afternoon, and then an evening, and then a nightmare that never ended. He represents the moment when America looked at itself and decided it had to do better. And because of him, because of a 6-year-old boy who just wanted to walk to the bus stop alone, this country built something. It built systems and organizations and alerts and databases. It built a network of protection that has brought hundreds of thousands of children back to their families. That is Etan's legacy. That is what his short life left behind. It's not the legacy anyone would have chosen for him. His parents certainly wouldn't have. They would have chosen a life, a full, ordinary, beautiful life for their son. But it is the legacy that exists, and it is real, and it is lasting, and it has saved lives. On May 25th of every year, if you're in America, take a moment. Not a long one, just a moment. Think about a little boy in a blue corduroy jacket stepping out onto a sidewalk in New York City, full of pride, full of life, ready to prove he was big enough to make it 2 blocks on his own. And think about all the children who have made it home because this country refused to forget him. His name was Etan Patz. He was 6 years old, and he changed America forever.